One of the more profound differences you can observe between the older generation of men going their own way and the younger generation, or indeed the youngest generation, is this idea of what you are supposed to do. This notion of doing the right thing, where the right thing is loosely defined as getting married, having kids, going through all the rituals, slaving at work for the sake of others. And the big differential here, of course, is that the older generation, many of whom had been married themselves and had done the right thing, they'd gone through the rituals, they had done what they were supposed to do, were ultimately penalized for doing the so-called right thing. And even those among us who never got married and never went down that route still found it quite suspicious and challenging, thinking about this question of, am I supposed to be doing X? You see, because the older generations still had this blueprint that had been handed down over the generations of the quote-unquote right thing, what you're supposed to do. And indeed, many of us found it wanting, even if we had never actively participated in the prescribed rituals. And again, as many of the men had done that and found it to be wanting, meaning they were actually punished for having done the right thing. So in this context, I'm loosely talking about Gen Xers. But if we fast forward to the Zoomers, the question of doing what you're supposed to do is very interesting, because the blueprint that I'm speaking of, this blueprint that we've been handed down of what we're supposed to do, essentially a dictum from on high, finish school, maybe study, work, get a job, and then find a wife and settle and have kids, and then labor away for the rest of your life and drop dead, that has shifted a great deal. Because what you're supposed to do in the current year, it's actually not clear at all, if you really think about it. Because I've talked about this before, the transition between the functional model of reproduction, mating, marriage, etc., was very, very porous even in the 90s. And even long before that, with decades prior, with massive spikes in divorce and what have you. It wasn't entirely clear that that was the right thing to do. But the difference, I would argue, was that for the older generation of men, as I pointed out in a recent video, in theory, at least in theory, and more often than not in practice, many of these things were in reach. Sure, it could go awry. Yes, of course, it could go awry. And it probably likely would have gone awry. But it was within reach. You could at least attempt this simulation of a prescription from a fantasy bygone era of 2.5 kids, a fence, a dog, a wife, etc., etc. Setting aside all the risks associated with that, it was accessible. Just like jobs were in this world. Because the perception back then, if you were to have a job, say part-time working, pumping gas at a gas station, was not that you were gainfully employed, but it was something to hold you over, something temporary. You were working towards something else. Now that, of course, still exists, but again, it's very different in the current environment. What are some of these differences? Well, if you look at the mating market, the what you're supposed to do is a non-starter. Remember, if we really pay attention to how skewed things have become and the general inaccessibility of vaginal canals and the general inaccessibility of dating in large, you can observe these differences right at the start. The current generation has no what you're supposed to do, and by that I mean the current generation of men, because it's all inaccessible to begin with. It's not a path that you might consider because the pathways have been blocked off. There's been an avalanche. There are boulders everywhere. Either way, you're kind of screwed. And on top of that, there's massive economic uncertainty. These days, it's not entirely abnormal if you're 30 and still living with your parents, let alone if you're 25 or 18 and you're working a part-time job. For example, I'm sure many of you remember in 2008, 2009, during the housing crisis and the Great Recession, how official documentation of employment would count people working 4 hours a week sometimes, or 12 hours a week. These days, in a way, the Great Recession is carried over, where at least officially, any kind of employment is viewed as employment. So naturally, the question arises, in contrast to the old question, should I be doing this? And by this, I mean this prescriptive outline and design for your life and how you're supposed to go about things, 2.5 kids, yada, yada, yada. And not even what am I supposed to do with my life? What on earth can I do with my life? And this is something I've thought about quite a bit, especially for the younger generations. It's one of the primary thoughts I have these days. What is going on with the youngest generation of men? Because when I look at them and when I interact with them, my sense is they don't know where to start. They're lost. They don't know how to make heads or tails of the situations they're in, and they're just biding time for tomorrow that will probably never come. Part of this has to do with the internet, obviously, and the way it's skewed along with things, certainly the dating market. But it goes beyond that, and this is just my opinion. I think that the internet has also skewed young men's ability to discern what their interests are in life, what they want to pursue, what they want to study, what they want to work as. These days, if you ask most young guys what they like doing, it will be a very generic, well, I like hanging out with my friends and playing video games. They're not going to say, I love reading books about astronomy or what have you. I mean, sure, you get those outliers, but they're reasonably rare. And what has happened vis-a-vis the internet, in addition to all the dating stuff, is that we've borne witness to a generic transformation of male interest, in the sense that rather than going down certain avenues as a young person, discovering what really, really tickles your funny bone, what really, really drives you, and what you might want to pursue later on, or even developing hobbies that are derived from that, you end up in a very different situation where all you do is spend your time and your life online, and as a consequence, you are not actually discovering those avenues, whatever it might be. Maybe you want to become an athlete. Maybe you want to become a botanist. Maybe you want to become an engineer because you're fascinated by the mechanics of how things work. Who knows? And many of these potentials are there in these young men, but they're simply not being exposed to it because the internet has taken up so much time, and it is taking up their attention spans. Because you have to understand that you can be the most talented human being on earth, but if you're never exposed to something and your attention is being drawn away from the potential pool of activities and things that you might have massive talent for, you're never going to discover. You're never going to be able to take a deep dive into this. So the question right now is no longer what am I supposed to do in the face of a litany of dictums or prescriptions that have been passed on from on high, but rather, what on earth can I do, and how do I go about this? Now, I don't like to prescribe anything, and this should not be seen as advice of any sort. But I would say the following, that if you're a young man and your path is as yet unclear, as it is in most of the cases, and most of the young men I meet, and you're spending copious amounts of time online in very undefined ways, you're just hanging out, but you're not learning anything, and you don't really feel drawn to anything, it might be time to rethink certain things. And again, this is just my opinion. Don't view this as advice. Take some time away from the internet. If you're interested in academic subjects, consider looking at books as opposed to just going on Wikipedia articles or whatever it is you might be inclined to do. But unless you're using the internet in a productive way, ultimately it becomes a time sink. And I'm no better or different in many ways. I don't read nearly as much as I used to, and by that I mean proper books. I'm not talking about reading emails or articles online. People of all ages have been taken in by the allure of the internet. It's massively distracting. It can be entertaining. But what are you really getting from it? If you can use it usefully to learn things, either things you're just interested in or you think are practically useful, that's great. But in most of the cases I've encountered, that happens to not be the case. It happens to be that people are just squandering their time and their day away. So what I think is possible that wasn't possible back then is, one, you've been freed from any sort of obligation that we formerly at least regarded as a de facto obligation that you should go down a certain career path and then get married and do the right thing. That's gone. That's been wiped off the table. To ultimate freedom in how you pursue your interests. But again, if you've been sucked into the eddy of generic internet interests, and we all like playing video games sometimes, rather than discovering what your individual interests are as a man, then I think something's gone awry. And there are ways you can course correct, as I mentioned. For example, spending time off the internet. Or when you do spend time, making sure it's directed towards something that you either think is interesting or useful to you. And I think that's very, very easy to discern. We all know when we just putz around and waste time online, it's when we're spending that time usefully online. It's pretty apparent, and I think most people recognize that. And it would certainly be a start. Again, the youngest generation is freed from even the feeblest notion of the obligations that have been set upon us, the older men. And discerning what's in your interest is both harder than ever, but also easier. So I would actually argue, spend some time away from the internet. Try to think about these things. It's no longer the question what you're supposed to do, but what can you do? Anyway, thanks for listening. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. As always, may the gods watch over you and you enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye. Take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.